Hello, and welcome to the Week of Transporters in Depression. In this video, we're going to explore affective disorders, specifically depression, and discuss monoamine neurotransmitters. The objectives of this week are to understand the definitions of depression and monoamines, to compare the different classes of drugs, so the tricyclic antidepressants versus the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, in their efficacy for relief of depression, their adverse effects, and their mechanism of action. I'd like you to note drug prototypes for each class, so nortriptyline for the TCAs and fluoxetine for the SSRIs. Depression is a very common disorder, and it is estimated that 8% of Americans over 20 years of age had depression in any given 2-week period. This equates to approximately 19 million people. Depression symptoms in the U.S. were threefold higher during 2020 and the COVID pandemic. Lastly, in 2020, 17% of adolescents 12 to 17 years old had at least one major depressive episode, and this is another 4.1 million people. The symptoms of depression are quite wide-ranging, and it presents differently in different people. In addition to the core signs of persistent sad or empty moods, and feelings of hopelessness or pessimism, you can see from this list that signs and symptoms have directionality. So you can either have decreased energy or fatigue, or feeling restless and having trouble sitting still. There is early morning awakening compared with oversleeping, and appetite changes can include increased or decreased appetite. An important consideration in pharmacotherapy are these differences in presenting symptoms. For example, some drugs produce drowsiness as a side effect and may be useful for patients with sleep difficulties to take at bedtime. The accidental discovery of antidepressant drugs in the early 1950s was instrumental in establishing that there was a biological basis for depression. One of the molecular frameworks to help understand affective disorders is the biogenic amine hypothesis. And although this hypothesis is overly simplistic and incomplete, it can help to understand the basic premise of monoamine action in depression. The hypothesis is that depression occurs when there is reduced receptor sensitivity or reduced amine neurotransmission, so serotonin or norepinephrine. Either deficiencies in the synthesis, storage, or release of these neurotransmitters produces depression. On the other hand, if there is elevated monoamine levels, this produces mania. The hypothesis itself is based on the circular argument that because all FDA-approved drugs that are effective in treating depression modify amine neurotransmission, an imbalance in monoamines must underlie the mechanisms of depression. So currently, all FDA-approved drugs for the treatment of depression act on monoamines. However, with more research and newer classes of antidepressants on the horizon, it is clear that this hypothesis is incomplete. Monoamines refer to neurotransmitters that have an amine group, and this includes norepinephrine, serotonin, and dopamine. In these lectures, we will focus on norepinephrine and serotonin. Now, not all neurotransmitters with an amino group are included in the monoamine category. Monoamines have one primary amino group connected to an aromatic ring by a 2-carbon chain, whereas acetylcholine, another neurotransmitter with an amine, has a quaternary amine. From a chemical perspective, the term monoamine does not really distinguish the monoamine neurotransmitters from amino acids. The term monoamine survives from early studies on a vasoconstricting substance isolated from the adrenal gland in the 1800s, which included norepinephrine. When scientists discovered the structures of these substances, they noted that they had a primary amine in common. Other neurotransmitters were discovered later, but the term monoamine was already established and stuck. Monoamine neurotransmitters use a different type of signaling compared with the traditional presynaptic and postsynaptic point-of-contact synapse that we have been discussing. With monoamines, such as serotonin and norepinephrine, the neurotransmission is much more diffuse and widespread, and can modulate a huge number of neurons and neural circuits. Instead of traditional synapses, there are boutons or swellings along a very long axon. Each bouton has the capability to package vesicles and release neurotransmitter, so this type of signaling can modulate a huge number of neurons. This type of diffuse modulation makes sense considering the wide-ranging symptoms involved in depression and affective disorders.